It began not with the roar of engines, but with silence, the silence of imagination. In the late 1930s, deep within the design offices of Messerschmitt AG, a small group of engineers stared at sketches that seemed to defy gravity itself. The drawings showed a machine unlike any aircraft the world had ever seen. Swept wings, no propeller, and engines shaped like cylinders slung beneath the fuselage. It looked alien, and in many ways it was. At its heart was a dream as old as flight itself: speed. The dream belonged to Willy Messerschmitt, an engineer whose obsession with innovation bordered on the fanatical. He had already built some of the Luftwaffe's most successful fighters, the sleek Bf-109s that had ruled the skies over Europe. But Messerschmitt wasn't content with victory. He wanted to break the limits of what was possible. He wanted to build a fighter that no enemy could touch. In 1939, when the world plunged into war, that dream took form. Under the secret designation Project 1065, Messerschmitt and his team began work on something extraordinary: a jet-powered aircraft. It would use no propeller, no piston engine, and no conventional wisdom. Instead, it would rely on turbojet propulsion, an idea still so new that even its inventors doubted it could work. At the center of this experiment stood a young engineer named Hans von Ohain, one of the pioneers of jet engine technology. His invention, the UMO 0004, promised to compress and ignite air at such velocity that thrust, not rotation, would drive the aircraft forward. In theory, it could propel a plane faster than any propeller ever could. The Germans called it the Strahljäger, the jet fighter. By early 1942, after years of cautious development and technical setbacks, the first prototype rolled out of the hangar at Augsburg, Messerschmitt Me-262 V1. It looked like something from the future: long, graceful wings, twin nacelles beneath them, and a shark-like nose designed for speed. But there was a problem. The jet engines were still unreliable. To keep the project alive, Messerschmitt installed a piston engine in the nose just to get the aircraft airborne. On its maiden flight, test pilot Fritz Wendel throttled up and the Me-262 rattled down the runway. The roar of the piston engine was soon drowned out by a new sound: a deep, metallic howl as the jets came to life. The aircraft lifted into the air like a blade cutting through the clouds. When it landed, Wendell stepped out of the cockpit pale, trembling, and awestruck. He said, "It flies like nothing on Earth. It is the future." That future, however, was not yet ready to fight a war. The early JUMO engines burned out only after 25 hours of flight. The heat melted turbines, bearings failed, and fuel lines ignited. Mechanics joked that the Me-262 needed an entire factory's worth of spare parts just to make one sortie. But the potential was undeniable. In level flight, it could reach 870 kilometers per hour or 540 miles per hour, nearly 200 kilometers faster than any Allied fighter. It could outclimb, outdive, and outrun everything in the sky. To the engineers, it was the ultimate defender, a weapon that could rise against the endless waves of Allied bombers and turn the tide of the air war. To the Luftwaffe generals, it was salvation. And to Adolf Hitler, it was something else entirely. When Hitler first heard of the Me-262, he was intrigued but distracted. The year was 1943, and Germany was bleeding on every front: in Russia, in North Africa, in the skies above Berlin. Reports of Allied bombing raids reached his headquarters daily. Entire cities were being erased from the map. Hitler demanded a Wunderwaffe, a miracle weapon to reverse Germany's collapse. Rockets, jets, super tanks, he wanted them all. So when General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most decorated fighter aces, invited him to witness the new jet fighter in person, Hitler agreed. The demonstration took place at Insterburg Airfield. On a clear spring morning, the Me-262 streaked across the sky, faster than any aircraft the Führer had ever seen. It climbed, banked, and roared past the viewing stand with the sound of thunder, compressed into a scream. Hitler watched in astonishment, his binoculars trembling in his hands. But as the plane touched down and taxied to a halt, he turned to his generals with an expression they had come to fear, a look of inspiration and obsession. "This is no defensive weapon," Hitler said. "This is the Blitz bomber that will strike terror into our enemies. They will never see it coming." In that moment, the fate of the Me-262 was sealed. Messerschmitt had built a fighter, fast, agile, revolutionary. But Hitler saw something else. A bomber that could carry the war back to London. A machine of vengeance that would strike from the clouds like a thunderbolt. No one dared argue. Goering, the Luftwaffe's commander, nodded obediently. The engineers exchanged anxious glances. Galland tried to protest. "Mein Führer, its speed makes it the perfect interceptor, not a bomber." Hitler cut him off. "The enemy bombards our cities every day. What good is defense? We must strike back." And so, by a single decree, the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, was forced into an identity crisis. The engineers were ordered to redesign it to carry bombs. Strengthening the fuselage meant adding weight. Adding weight meant losing speed. New bomb racks disrupted airflow, reducing range and agility. Each modification pushed the aircraft further away from what it was meant to be. Messerschmitt himself called it madness. The redesign consumed months. Test flights were delayed, production slowed. By the time the first Me-262 Blitz bomber was ready, Allied bombers had already begun to flatten the factories that built it. While the prototype sat on runways unarmed and half-finished, the skies over Germany turned black with American B-17s and B-24s. The very weapon designed to stop them was grounded by politics, by ego, and by one man's refusal to listen. Adolf Galland later wrote bitterly, "The Me-262 was born a year too late, and that year was lost to Hitler's obsession." Yet, for the men who saw it fly, hope still lingered. Pilots whispered that if they could just get it into combat, the war might yet be changed. The Me-262 was faster than a Mustang, stronger than a Thunderbolt, and decades ahead of anything the Allies could imagine. But in 1943, time was something Germany no longer had. The dream of speed, the dream that might have saved the Reich's Air Force, was being buried under orders, delays, and the crumbling weight of a dying empire. And in that darkness, the Me-262 waited. Its engines silent, its destiny stolen, for a war that was already slipping away.
By the summer of 1943, Germany's skies were no longer safe. From dawn to dusk, the drone of Allied bombers filled the air, vast armadas of flying fortresses and liberators stretching from horizon to horizon. Cities that had once stood proud, Hamburg, Cologne, Kassel, now glowed red at night, their streets buried under dust and ash. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Hitler's Reich, was dying. Its pilots were exhausted, its aircraft obsolete, its fuel reserves dwindling. Every day, the Americans came in greater numbers, flying higher and faster, escorted by the new P-51 Mustang, which could range all the way to Berlin and back. Germany was being bombed into submission, and the man who had once commanded the Lightning War of 1939 was now desperate for a miracle. That desperation would destroy the very miracle he already had. In August 1943, at Insterburg Airfield, the future of air warfare roared across the sky. The Me-262 performed its first high-speed flight before Hitler and his inner circle. The jet was flawless, sleek, silver, and terrifyingly fast. It tore across the horizon like a bolt of light, leaving even seasoned Luftwaffe officers speechless. When the plane landed and taxied to a halt, Willy Messerschmitt stepped forward to explain the technical marvel his team had created. He spoke of turbojet thrust, acceleration, intercept ranges, the ability to climb faster than any piston-engine aircraft alive. To the engineers, it was a weapon of defense, a shield for the Reich, designed to intercept bombers before they reached the cities. But to Hitler, standing beside the runway, the word defense was poison. He turned to Göring and said quietly, "Why defend when we can attack?" What followed would become one of the most disastrous orders in military history. Hitler decided that the Me-262 should not be a fighter at all. It should be a blitz bomber, a lightning-fast strike aircraft capable of carrying bombs over enemy cities. No one dared contradict him. Messerschmitt tried to reason with the Führer, explaining that the aircraft's aerodynamic design made it ideal for interception, not for bombing runs. Attaching bomb racks would destabilize its center of gravity, slow it down, and strain its fragile engines. But Hitler was unmoved. His imagination was already on fire. He said, "We will strike London again. They will see vengeance from the skies." The order spread through the Luftwaffe like a curse. The engineers, already working under impossible conditions, now had to redesign the aircraft mid-production, reinforcing the fuselage, recalculating weight distribution, reworking fuel flow. Each change delayed the project by weeks, then months. In the meantime, Allied bombers kept coming. Factories in Augsburg, Regensburg, and Schweinfurt, the very sites producing Me-262 components, were bombed repeatedly. Workers died at their stations. Machinery lay twisted under collapsed roofs. The few completed aircraft were scattered in hangars or hidden under camouflage nets. By the time the first bomber variant of Me-262 was ready, Germany's industrial heart was already in ruins. Among the Luftwaffe's top aces, frustration turned to fury. General Adolf Galland, a man who had spent his career defending Germany's skies, saw the decision as madness. In one of the war's most famous confrontations, Galland stood before Hitler at the Berghof and dared to speak his mind. "Mein Führer," he said, his voice steady but strained, "the Me-262 is the best fighter we will ever have. It is our only chance to defend the Reich." Hitler's eyes flashed. "The bombers destroy our cities every day. If we can strike back, we will break their morale. The Me-262 will do this. It will be my blitz bomber." Galland tried again. "But sir, it is not built for that purpose." "I have made my decision," Hitler roared. "The jet will be a bomber." The meeting ended in silence. Galland left knowing what it meant. The Luftwaffe's last hope had been crippled by the man who commanded it. Back in Augsburg, the engineers obeyed. They added bomb mounts under the fuselage. They tested takeoffs with 250-kilogram payloads. They modified the landing gear and strengthened the wings. The result was exactly as they feared. The Me-262 lost speed, stability, and its razor-sharp agility. The bomber variant could barely outrun Allied fighters anymore, and its payload was too small to damage strategic targets meaningfully. It was, in every sense, a weapon without purpose. As 1944 began, the Allied bombing campaign reached its peak. Day after day, American and British planes turned German cities into rubble. Every morning, the sirens wailed. Every night, the flames glowed on the horizon. Hitler raged at his generals. He demanded to know why his miracle jet was not flying in combat. Göring, desperate to appease him, blamed the engineers. The engineers blamed the fuel shortages. The truth was simpler. Hitler's obsession had stolen an entire year from the Me-262's deployment. By the time it was finally reauthorized to serve as a fighter again, it was already too late. The first operational Me-262 squadrons, under Commando Novotny, didn't take the skies until mid-1944. Their pilots flying the original unmodified jet fighter design were stunned by its power. It could dive past 500 miles per hour, climb away from a P-51 Mustang like a ghost, and tear through bomber formations in seconds. But the Allies had already learned to adapt. Their fighters began patrolling Me-262 bases, waiting to strike as the jets took off or landed when their engines were weakest. For every Me-262 that managed to climb to altitude, 2 more were destroyed on the ground. Within months, the Luftwaffe's hope had become its tragedy. What should have been a revolutionary weapon, a jet that could have changed the course of the air war, was now a victim of delay, interference, and a dictator's pride. The men who flew it knew this. They called their aircraft Die Schwalbe, the Swallow, for its speed and grace, but they also called it Der verloren Engel, the lost angel. It was too late to save Germany, too precious to abandon, and too advanced for the war it was born into. By the end of 1944, only a handful of Me-262s had seen combat. The Allies had total air superiority. German industry lay in ruins, and yet Hitler still believed that his miracle bomber could turn the tide. He issued one last decree. All Me-262s were to be fitted for bombing runs. When his officers told him that the enemy was already at the gates of the Reich, he replied coldly, "Then we will bomb them from the ruins." The engineers knew then that the Me-262, the plane that could have saved the Luftwaffe, had instead become a monument to delusion. It was not technology that had failed Germany. It was leadership. As Galland later wrote, the jet was a promise of what could have been, strangled by the hands of the man who demanded its birth.
By the summer of 1944, Germany's skies were no longer a battlefield. They were a graveyard. Every day, thousands of American bombers thundered toward the Reich, escorted by silver phantoms with stars on their wings. The P-51 Mustang now flew deep into the heart of Germany, guarding the bombers like hawks. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was shattered, its best aces dead, its fuel nearly gone. And yet, from the smoke of defeat, something extraordinary finally took to the air. After years of delays, sabotage, and political insanity, the Messerschmitt Me-262 was finally being built, in secret, in pieces, scattered across caves and underground factories. The engineers had stopped listening to Hitler. The jet would not be a bomber. It would be what it was meant to be, a fighter. The first operational jet unit, Kommando Novotny, was formed in the summer of 1944 at Akmer Airfield. It was named for Major Walter Novotny, a 23-year-old ace with more than 250 kills to his name, one of the Luftwaffe's last living legends. When Novotny climbed into the cockpit of the Me-262 for the first time, he immediately understood what it represented. The twin Umo 004 engines howled like wild animals as they spooled up. The aircraft began to roll, slowly at first, then faster still. At 160 kilometers per hour, the Me-262 leapt from the runway like a living thing. It didn't fly, it accelerated. For the first time since 1940, the Germans had something that could truly terrify the Allies. The Me-262 could fly faster than 870 kilometers per hour, almost 200 faster than a Mustang. It could climb straight through bomber formations, fire its 4 30mm Mk-108 cannons, and vanish before the escort fighters even reacted. Allied pilots who encountered it for the first time were stunned. They radioed back frantic reports. "Fastest thing I've ever seen. Can't catch it. Can't even turn with it." A B-17 gunner described watching one pass his formation. "It came from nowhere, a blur of gray metal. I saw a flash, and then the bomber next to us just exploded." For a few breathtaking weeks, it seemed that Germany had built the impossible, a machine that could reverse the tide of the air war. But miracles do not survive reality. The Me-262's engines were fragile. They needed to be warmed for 8 minutes before takeoff, a death sentence under constant bombardment. Pilots who tried to rush the process risked flameouts or compressor explosions. Once airborne, the jet was unstoppable, but during takeoff and landing, it was a sitting duck. The Allies learned this fast. P-51 squadrons began patrolling near Me-262 bases, waiting for them to lift off or return. The sleek, powerful jets, kings of the air at altitude,
were slaughtered like lambs on the runway. At Lechfeld, Rhein-Main, and Akmer, entire units were wiped out before ever firing a shot. The Luftwaffe adapted. They built longer runways, installed flak guns near airstrips, and trained their pilots to approach landing fields at high speed, cutting engines at the last second. Even so, every sortie was a gamble. Major Novotny's final flight proved it. On November 8, 1944, he took off from Akmer to intercept Allied bombers approaching Hanover. He climbed through the clouds, spotted a formation of B-24s, and dove in. In seconds, he downed two of them, flashes of fire blooming in the sky. But as he banked to escape, his left engine failed. Then the right one caught fire. Allied Mustangs pounced. A burst of .5 caliber fire tore through his fuselage. Novotny's Mi-262 crashed into a forest near Epi. There was no explosion, just a dull thud and a column of smoke rising into the cold November air. He was 23 years old. The Luftwaffe lost its brightest star, and the world lost the first ace of the jet age. Even after his death, the Mi-262 continued to fight, but always outnumbered, always too few, always too late. The pilots who flew it were no longer seasoned veterans, but boys, some barely 19, trained for weeks instead of months. They climbed into machines that could outrun the enemy, but not escape the war. They called themselves the Turbojager, the Jet Hunters, and they flew knowing that every sortie might be their last. In December 1944, Adolf Galland finally got his wish. He was given command of Jagdverband 44, an elite squadron flying Mi-262s exclusively as interceptors. Under his leadership, they developed tactics that terrified the Allies. Head-on assaults, lightning dives through bomber formations, coordinated hit-and-run strikes. In one raid over Germany, Galland's unit destroyed 15 bombers in a single engagement without a single loss. For a fleeting moment, it seemed that the jet had fulfilled its promise. But Galland knew the truth. There were fewer than 200 Mi-262s ready for combat. The Americans had more than 10,000 aircraft in the sky. The outcome was no longer in doubt. "We were lions," Galland wrote later, but the cage was already on fire. As the war dragged into winter, the Mi-262 became a weapon of desperation. Fuel shortages grounded entire squadrons. Bombing raids destroyed repair shops faster than they could be rebuilt. The once sleek jets sat in hangars under camouflage nets, their fuselages streaked with soot, their engines starving for kerosene that no longer existed. The pilots grew bitter. They had touched the future and been abandoned by it. One Mi-262 flyer wrote in his diary, "Each flight feels like flying against time itself. We can kill them, but there are always more." Meanwhile, Allied pilots developed countermeasures. The key was patience. They didn't try to chase the Mi-262 in the air. They waited for it near the ground. When a jet came in for a landing, its speed dropped below 300 miles per hour, its engines fragile, its flaps extended. That's when the Mustangs struck. To the Mi-262 pilots, those final seconds before landing were the worst part of the war. Aces like Kurt Welter and Franz Schall learned to land under fire, engines sputtering, wings riddled with bullets, fuel tanks nearly empty. Some didn't make it. Many crashed on their own runways. Still, even in defeat, the Mi-262 terrified the Allies. The Americans called it the Storm Bird. The British intelligence labeled it the Jet of Death. And deep down, every Allied pilot who faced one knew if Germany had deployed this machine just a year earlier, the skies over Europe might have belonged to the swastika once more. It was, as one P-51 pilot put it, like fighting the future, and the future was trying to kill you. By the end of 1944, the Mi-262 had proven everything its creators had promised, and nothing its leaders had hoped for. It could win battles, but not the war. Every time it took to the air, it reminded the world of what Germany's engineers could build, and how completely their leaders had failed them.
The jet was the embodiment of a paradox, a weapon so far ahead of its time that it arrived too late to matter. In the dying months of 1944, while Me-262s streaked across the sky in small, desperate numbers, Allied bombers were already flattening the cities that had built them. Germany had finally created the perfect fighter, just in time for no one to save.
By the beginning of 1945, the Reich was dying, and everyone knew it. From the air, Germany looked like a wound that would not heal. Every major city lay in ruins, its factories silent, its railways twisted, its people living in the shadows of what had once been civilization. The skies belonged entirely to the Allies now. Day after day, the drone of engines filled the air, endless formations of B-17s and B-24s that blotted out the sun. And somewhere beneath those darkened skies, the last miracle of the Luftwaffe was still trying to fight. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the fastest and most advanced aircraft in the world, had finally reached the battlefield in meaningful numbers. But it was too little, too late. The miracle had arrived after faith had already died. In theory, Germany possessed over 1,400 Me-262 airframes by early 1945, an astonishing figure on paper. In practice, barely 150 were flyable at any given time. The rest were scattered across fields, hangars, and tunnels, waiting for engines, for parts, for fuel that no longer existed. The UMO-004 turbojets, masterpieces of innovation and fragility, required materials Germany could no longer afford. Nickel and chromium were gone. Mechanics resorted to poor substitutes that cracked and melted after only a dozen hours of flight. Pilots joked bitterly that they were flying on borrowed engines. Every takeoff was a bet with fate. One Me-262 pilot, Oberleutnant Rudolf Sinner, put it simply: "Our jet could outrun the enemy, but not the war." Hitler's interference continued till the end. Even as the Allies crossed the Rhine, he still demanded a bomber version of the Me-262, believing that these Blitz bombers could strike London one last time and prove the Reich undefeated. The generals pleaded with him to focus on interception, to protect what was left of Germany's burning cities. He refused. To Hitler, the Me-262 was not a weapon, it was symbolism, a gesture of vengeance, a ghost of the Blitz he had once commanded. He spoke of turning points and miracles, even as his empire crumbled around him. Inside the airfields, those words felt like mockery. The pilots of Jagdverband 44, led by Adolf Galland, knew better. They had no illusions left. They were professionals, veterans, and survivors, flying machines built from genius and desperation. Galland's men called themselves the Squadron of the Jet Knights. They painted the undersides of their Me-262s bright red so that German flak gunners would recognize them as friendly when they screamed across the sky. They were outnumbered 100 to 1, but they flew anyway. In March 1945, Galland personally led a sortie of Me-262s against an American bomber formation near Munich. He downed a B-26 before his own cockpit filled with smoke. Shrapnel had ripped through his right engine. He bailed out and landed in a field, his leg broken, his war effectively over. When he was taken to a field hospital, he told the doctor, "The Me-262 is magnificent, but no machine can save a dead nation." For those who still flew, the war had become a suicide pact. Fuel shortages meant that pilots often got one flight, maybe two, before their aircraft were cannibalized for parts. Engines flamed out mid-air. Airfields were bombed faster than they could be repaired. The once glorious Luftwaffe had been reduced to a handful of desperate men, flying the world's most advanced airplane from dirt runways, hunted by Mustangs the moment they left the ground. It was no longer a war of nations. It was a war between time and inevitability. The Me-262 still inspired awe, even among its enemies. Allied pilots who shot one down often approached the wreck afterward with reverence.
The aircraft looked like something from another century, smooth, swept, futuristic. American engineers swarmed over every crash site, taking notes, measuring every rivet. They realized immediately what the Germans had created. One American intelligence officer wrote, "It was as if we'd been fighting knights with swords, and suddenly one of them showed up with a laser." But technology without strategy is nothing more than brilliance buried in rubble. By April 1945, the Reich was collapsing on every front. Soviet armies had reached the Oder. The Americans were on the Elbe. The skies above Berlin were a constant storm of Allied aircraft. And yet, even in those final days, Me-262s were still taking off from makeshift strips, their pilots clinging to duty as the world ended around them. Some fought to the last, like Heinz Bahr, who scored 16 jet victories before Germany fell. Others used their final fuel to flee west, hoping to surrender to the Americans instead of the Soviets. A few were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. At Lechfeld Airfield, mechanics wept as they set fire to the machines they had built with their own hands. Flames licked the polished fuselages, turning the silver metal black. The age of the jet had been born, in smoke and ruin. When Berlin finally fell in May 1945, dozens of Me-262s were discovered in hangars and tunnels, hidden like relics from a vanished world. Some were complete, others half-assembled, frozen in time. The last breath of an empire that believed too much in miracles and too little in reason. American and Soviet engineers were astonished. They shipped the jets home piece by piece to be studied and copied. Within 5 years, the descendants of the Me-262, the F-86 Sabre and MiG-15, would usher in a new era of warfare. But the original creators of the jet, the pilots, the engineers, the dreamers, were gone. Some dead, some prisoners, some silent for the rest of their lives. The Me-262 had achieved the impossible and accomplished nothing. It had proven that human ingenuity could leap ahead of its time, yet also that genius, without wisdom, leads only to ashes. For the men who survived, the memory of its roar was both pride and pain. They had touched the future and watched it die in their hands. In his memoir, Adolf Galland wrote the epitaph of the Me-262. It was a bird of paradise, born in a cage of madness. We built the future, but we were forbidden to use it. The jet's engines may have fallen silent, but its legacy roared on, not as a triumph of Nazi power, but as a warning carved into the history of war. The Me-262 had not failed. It had arrived in a world unworthy of it.
When the war finally ended, the Me-262 did not vanish into history, it haunted it. The Allies scoured Germany for what remained of the jet, and what they found astonished them. Hidden in underground factories, buried beneath mountains, scattered across runways, lay hundreds of sleek, unfinished fuselages, the skeletons of a future that had arrived too soon. To the victors, these machines were not merely trophies, they were blueprints for the world to come. In June 1945, American engineers from the U.S. Army Air Forces entered Lechfeld Airfield, the spiritual home of the Me-262. There, between craters and the blackened husks of hangars, they found several jets still intact. Mechanics who had once built them now stood quietly beside the wrecks, their faces gray with exhaustion. The Americans moved in with measuring tapes, cameras, and notebooks. They documented everything: the shape of the wings, the design of the engines, the layout of the cockpit. What they saw defied their expectations. The Me-262's airframe was not only faster than anything in the Allied arsenal, it was aerodynamically clean, elegant, and efficient in a way no propeller aircraft could ever be. Its wings were swept at a subtle angle, a design feature that would later become standard in jet aviation. Even its flaws fascinated them. The Jumo 004 engines, though unreliable, embodied the first practical step toward sustained jet propulsion. The Germans had done it first, with less material, less time, and under constant bombardment. It was genius born under ruin. In the months that followed, teams of engineers shipped the jets home. The United States took a dozen, designated P-262s, for testing at Wright Field. The British captured several and sent them to Farnborough. The Soviets, moving quickly through occupied territory, seized entire trainloads of parts and engineers from the Messerschmitt works. The jet that had once symbolized Nazi power now became the seed of post-war progress. Within 5 years, both superpowers would field aircraft descended from its design. In the skies over Korea, American F-86 Sabres and Soviet MiG-15s, each drawing lessons from the Me-262, dueled in the first great jet versus jet combat of history. The Cold War's race for the heavens had begun, and its bloodline traced back to that German machine that never had its chance. But for those who had built and flown it, the legacy of the Me-262 was not triumph, it was tragedy. Willy Messerschmitt, the man who had once dreamed of speed, was imprisoned after the war, accused of using forced labor. He served 2 years before returning to aviation, designing civilian aircraft in a world that no longer wanted his genius associated with war. Adolf Galland, the general who had fought to use the jet properly, was captured by the Allies and later worked as a consultant in South America. He remained proud of the Me-262, calling it the finest aircraft ever built under the worst possible circumstances. And the young pilots, those who had flown the Stormbird into impossible odds, rarely spoke of it again. Many were dead, their names forgotten in the rubble of 1945. Those who lived carried the sound of its engines in their dreams. One survivor, Oberleutnant Hans Fay, later wrote in his diary, "When I closed the canopy, the war disappeared. For a few minutes, I was free, faster than death itself. But freedom doesn't last long when the world is ending." The Me-262 became a paradox, both a symbol of what technology could achieve and a warning of what ambition could destroy. Historians would argue for decades about its what-ifs. What if Hitler had not interfered? What if the jet had entered service in 1943 when the Luftwaffe still had fuel and experienced pilots? Could it have changed the war? The answer, like the plane itself, is complicated. Yes, the Me-262 could have inflicted devastating losses on Allied bombers, perhaps delaying the inevitable. But it could never have stopped the tides of production and manpower that defined modern war. America built 10,000 aircraft a month by 1944. Germany could barely build a fraction of that. No machine, no matter how advanced, could overcome mathematics. But the tragedy of the Me-262 is not that it failed, it's that it never had the chance to succeed. In the decades that followed, the jet became an icon of the impossible. In museums across the world, in Washington, London, Munich, and even Moscow, visitors stand beneath its wings and feel the same awe that Hitler once felt at Insterburg. But unlike him, they understand what it represents, a masterpiece suffocated by arrogance. The paint has faded, the engines are silent, but the shape still feels futuristic. Its lines speak of a generation of engineers who built the future with nothing but courage and conviction, and were crushed by the madness that commanded them. A small plaque in the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum carries a quiet epitaph. First operational jet fighter in history, built too late to change the war, but soon enough to change the world. The Me-262's legacy lives not in conquest, but in transformation. Every modern jet owes something to it,
The shape of its wings, the placement of its engines, the way it sliced through air at speeds once thought impossible. The technology it pioneered reshaped everything from military flight to commercial aviation. In that sense, the Me-262 won a greater victory than any Hitler could have imagined. It survived him. It outlived the Reich, the war, and even the idea of war itself. It proved that progress cannot be buried even under the ruins of tyranny. Yet standing before one of the last surviving Me-262s today, you can still sense the ghosts within its frame. The young pilots who never came home, the engineers who watched their creation burn, the dream of flight twisted into the machinery of destruction. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the whisper of its engines, a sound that once belonged to the future. A sound that still asks the same question history never stops asking. What if brilliance had been guided by reason, not by madness? In the end, the Me-262 was not the weapon that doomed the Allies. It was the warning that doomed the Reich. A miracle built too late, commanded by a man who believed only in revenge, and remembered forever as the fighter that could have changed the world if only the world had been ready for it.